Thank you so much for being here. Today I'm going to talk about a paper by Shah and Robinson from 2006 called User Involvement in Healthcare Technology Development and Assessment. It's a structured literature review. What this paper really focuses on is a simple but important question. When healthcare technologies are developed, are the actual users being involved in the process? Like, are they involved enough? Moving on to the introduction slide here. So the main problem the authors are pointing out is that healthcare technologies, especially medical devices, are often designed without enough input from the people who would actually use them. When they say users, they're not talking about a group of people. They mean clinicians, patients, and others who interact with these technologies in real setting. The author argues that if these users are not involved, then the technology may not really meet the needs, even if it looks good from technical point of view. So the research problem is about the gap between designing technologies and understanding the people who will actually use it. So moving on to the next slide, why this topic is important. This topic matters because healthcare technology is not only about whether a device works in theory, it also matters whether it fits real clinical practices, real patient experience, and real work environments. A device can be technically advanced, but if it is hard to use, poorly matched to user needs, or disruptive in practice, then its value become limited. This is why user involvement is so important in developing an assessment. Moving on to the slide 4, which is research objective. The goal of this paper is to examine how users are involved in healthcare technology. More specifically, the users want to review the literature in a structured way so they can identify how user involvement happens, who is involved, and what pattern appears across situations. So the research question here is, the paper does not give formal hypothesis, which makes sense because this is a literature review. Instead it is a guided by a few practical research questions. For example, who are the users involved in healthcare technology development and assessment? And at what stages? At what stage of technology life cycle are they involved at? What methods do they use to gather their opinions and experiences? And overall, what trends or patterns can we see in the literature about user involvement? So even without formal hypothesis, the study still has a clear direction. So the type of study. This paper is a structured literature review, which means the author are not collecting new experimental or survey data themselves. Instead, they are reviewing previously published studies to build a broader understanding of how user involvement has been discussed and practiced in healthcare technology development. The data source here is for this review. It comes from peer-reviewed journal articles which are published between 1980 and 2005. The author approached this topic from a social perspective. I should say social science perspective, which is why it is important because it focuses on attention on people, participation, and real life context, not just technical performances. So in the study, the data are really the published studies themselves and the evidence those studies provide about user involvement. So the research methodology here is, the study has two main parts. The first one is the author carried out a structured review of literature from 1980 to 2005. Then after identifying relevant studies, they used qualitative thematic analysis. That means they looked across the literature for recurring themselves and patterns. For example, they analyzed which users were involved at which stage and what methods they used to collect users' perspective. Data and empirical model. So if we talk about the empirical model, this paper does not use a statistical model or econometric analysis. Instead, the author used a descriptive and interpretive framework. In simple terms, they classify the literature into categories such as user type, technology stage, and involvement methods, and then compare patterns across those categories. So the model here is really a structured analytical framework, not a mathematical one. So that brings us to our key finding. One of the most important key finding is that users are not all the same. The review shows that users include clinicians, patients, and others. That may sound obvious, but it is actually a big point because different users have different needs, different skills, and different environment. So the paper stresses that user involvement has to take this diversity seriously. Another major finding is that users are involved at different stages of medical devices, but not equally at every stage. The author found that user involvement happens most in design stage, then in testing and trial, and then in development, and at least in the concept stage. At least in the concept stage. That is interesting because it suggests that users are often brought in after the main idea is already formed. In other words, they are more involved in improving a technology than in shaping the original concept. The author, moving on to the next slide here, limitations and implications. The author do mention a limitation in this review. They note that they do not include relevant engineering, medical, and nursing literature that might have provided useful evidence. Even so, the study still offers useful insights for healthcare. More broadly, the biggest takeaway is that the user involvement should not be treated as something optional or added at the end. It should be built into the process earlier and more systematically if the technologies are going to truly meet the real world needs. That's my take on it. To wrap this paper up, this paper gives a strong overview of how users are involved in healthcare technology and development. This shows that users are diverse. Involvement happens unevenly across the life cycles. The most common method are usability testing, interview surveys. Overall, the paper makes a strong case for more thoughtful and earlier user involvement in healthcare technology design. I will take any questions you have in the comments below, so let me know. Thank you. Bye-bye.